Hi there, Ken Fader, your friendly neighborhood archaeologist, welcoming you back to this series on archaeology. Today we're going to be talking about death and blood and murder and sacrifice and worse, actually. But before we do that, before we talk about sacred chambers and sacrificial tables, I've said this in my presentation on Etched in Stone. I really don't care the order in which y'all watch these. Maybe you'll look at one of them, maybe you'll look at all of them, whatever you like. And the order is unimportant, with the possible exception of the fact that the lecture or the episode titled "How Do We Know? How Do You Know?" that really talks about how archaeologists go about the process of answering questions, of solving mysteries. And so many of the ones after that are about solving mysteries or answering questions. It helps if you know a little bit about archaeological methodology. But just in case you haven't seen that one, or if you've forgotten, it's been a while, so you don't remember that one so much, I'm going to repeat a couple of slides from that introductory episode that will help you understand why archaeologists are super skeptical about these sacred chambers and sacrificial altar stones. So we start with this, right? Archaeology is sometimes called the study of other people's garbage. Most of the archaeological record, it's not treasure, it's not hoards of gold, it's not great, hoards of mummies, it's not great monuments like pyramids. That's part of archaeology, absolutely, for sure. But most archaeologists, most of the time, are rummaging around in other people's waste, in other people's garbage. The things that people made and used, but then discarded and lost, and that have fortuitously preserved. So that's what we find most of the time. Now, the watchword here is the important thing to remember is that each group of people, their garbage, their stuff, their material culture, the things they made and used, threw away, they do that in a cultural context. And that each one is unique, each one is different. So the garbage produced and disposed by these people over here is recognizably different from the garbage used and disposed of by the people over here. And archaeologists are really good at that. They're good at finding that stuff, they're good at interpreting that stuff, and they're good at recognizing the differences. So we talk about things that are diagnostic of a particular group of people. So when we talk about in the episode on Etched in Stone, the written art, the artifacts that have written messages inscribed in them, we talked about, but what else is there? Because people don't just inscribe messages and then leave. They live in an area, they eat food, they make tools, they lose stuff, they throw stuff away. Is there that kind of evidence? That's the gold standard in archaeology. Same thing is true here. While instead of inscriptions, we have these large artifacts that either they're, in the case here, we're going to talk about a sacrificial altar stone, but also various other large features of the landscape, of the cultural landscape. We still are going to ask, all right, if people were here long enough to have left this ceremonial object, what else is there? Is there evidence of their everyday existence? Because if there's not that kind of evidence, archaeologists are very skeptical, because it's impossible for us to conceive of a culture that doesn't leave behind garbage. People are slobs everywhere and every place and every when, and they leave stuff behind. If they didn't, we couldn't do archaeology. That's what the archaeological record really is all about. So now, the specific places and artifacts I talk about here today, the question you should have in mind is, all right, well, where's the rest of their stuff? Where are these people living? Where were they throwing away their garbage while they were sacrificing people on altar stones? The first site, I love this place. Make no mistake about it. It was called, back in the 30s, it was called Patty's Caves, then it was called Mystery Hill, and today, over the last couple decades now, it's been called America's Stonehenge. It doesn't look anything at all like Stonehenge, but the argument is that it's aligned celestially like Stonehenge with the equinoxes and the solstices. It is a fascinating place. My skepticism should in no way prevent you or preclude you from going and visiting the place in North Salem, New Hampshire. It's open to the public, it's a tourist destination, and it's a really, really cool place. I don't think it's what the people who own the place say it is or have said for years, but that's neither here nor there. Let me explain my archaeological skepticism during the course of this conversation. So, lots of stone walls, lots of stone chambers, stone tunnels, stone objects that don't quite match what we see elsewhere. On an individual basis, most of these individual elements of America's Stonehenge, oh yeah, we see those at other colonial or other historical sites that are after Europeans moved into New England. But all taken all together, yeah, it's unique. Absolutely. It's unique. It's strange. It's fascinating. Go and see it for yourself, for sure. It's located there in North Salem, New Hampshire. So over the course of these 10 lectures, man, I'm giving you a tour, most of it here in North America, because that's the stuff I'm most familiar with, and I've been to all of these places. So there we are in North Salem, just over the Massachusetts border, and you walk around, and yeah, it's fascinating. You see that chamber in the background, and a little enclosure there in the foreground, and a wall in the background, and lots of stone chambers. Now, for some people, the argument is, number one, it's not Native American. Number two, they deny that it could be colonial or historical, recent historical, but instead it's the product of an ancient Celtic migration to the New World. That these Celts, these are people from the British Isles, who had among them a priestly class called Druids. The Druids are not an ethnicity, they're not a race, they are a priestly class of ordinary Celts, of ordinary folks living in the western part of Europe, mostly the British Isles, but also in France, and we're talking about a couple of thousand years ago. If somebody says to you, well, the Druids built Stonehenge, we know that categorically to be false. Stonehenge is 4,500 years old. It's far older than any evidence of Druids. Druids show up maybe 2,000 years ago, maybe a little before. Nothing to do with Stonehenge. But did they make it to the New World? Were they living in North Salem, New Hampshire a few thousand years ago, 2,000 years ago or longer? These are artists' conceptions of Druids. Druids are usually shown in artists' conceptions wearing like white robes and garlands of leaves. And they are considered to be have some kind of hook into the supernatural. So were they in New Hampshire, along with regular and ordinary Celts, like thousands of years ago? I tend to fall back on calling it Mystery Hill because that's what it was when my parents took me to it when I was a kid. That's what it was a couple of the times that I visited. I've been there several times, and so I'm not quite used to calling it America's Stonehenge, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative way that it's Mystery Hill. That just was the name of it for years. Interesting chambers, and again, and stone walls and upright stones, maybe pointing to various places on the horizon that are of importance in terms of a seasonal calendar. Cool place. But what was it? The most interesting, significant, kind of iconic artifact found at America's Stonehenge is this big flat slab of granite. And if you look carefully, you'll see it has a channel etched into the perimeter. And there's a little bit of an exit there on the lower right. The channel continues to the edge. And that certainly looks like it's for collecting a liquid in the channel and then moving it towards that exit and then collecting it maybe in a pot. The overall size of that, it's more than large enough for an adult human being to lie down lengthwise on that. So what was that? I mean, most people looking at an artifact like that would probably not have any idea of any utilitarian purpose for that. The folks who own America's Stonehenge have for years claimed that they knew what it was. And they claimed it, and they were so certain of it, they put up a sign. The sign says, "To the sacrificial table," which actually sounds kind of ominous to me. I mean, hopefully that wasn't up while they were sacrificing people. So a bunch of people are waiting in line, walking towards, oh, where are we going? I don't know, we're going over there. What does that sign say? "To the sacrificial table." Oh, what? That would really make me want to stay in that line. But of course, I'm being silly and snarky. But that's what it says today. And wait a minute, human sacrifice in New Hampshire? Here's another photo of the table and with some arrows helping you figure out. We've got that channel intended to collect some kind of liquid and then a little exit channel. Now, the image that I've seen pieces of art, not necessarily at America's Stonehenge, that show white-robed druids at this particular slab of granite, collecting blood in a chalice, a dead body on there, the throat slit, and the blood comes hurtling out of the body, out of the carotid artery, and some of it goes on the ground, but some of it collects on the stone, and it collects in that channel. It's collected then in a pot by a druid for some horrible, awful, satanic reason, use in some kind of ceremony. At least that's the implication. Here's another angle of the sacrificial table. And here it is, kind of from below looking up. So it's on these stones, instead of stone pillars, it's like a segmented stones, one on top of the other. And it's relatively flat. So we've got questions. Calling something a sacrificial table is not inherently dumb or foolish or silly, at least not initially. It's a hypothesis. Hey, we're spitballing here. What could that have been used for? Well, maybe it was for human sacrifice. That's okay. That's fine. Science is all about suggesting interesting and maybe extreme explanations, but we don't stop there. We don't just say, yep, that's what it is. It's an altar. Okay, let's move on. It's an altar because it looks like one. What does that even mean? Let's test it out. Let's see if there's any supporting evidence for this having been used to collect blood from a human or animal sacrifice. So I'm going to go through these 5. Is there a historical context in the Old World? So in other words, the question there is, well, if you're saying these are Celts from the British Isles, and they came to New Hampshire and they continued a cultural behavior, human sacrifice, well, then there must be evidence, direct evidence from their homeland that they did this. And so one would expect we would see artifacts like the altar stone at America's Stonehenge. We would expect to find models of that back home. 2, blood evidence. 3, I'll talk about these all individually. This is the Bronze Age, when this is supposed to be occupied. Are there bronze daggers there or any kind of tools for cutting the throat of the poor sacrificial victim? Is the table in a clearly ceremonial context? Is there no possible kind of practical context in which that table could have been used? And 5, is the table unique? I mean, we don't expect there to be a whole lot of human sacrifice going on among a small group of immigrant Druid priest Celts. So is it kind of unique? Is it like a one-off? And we can answer all of these questions more or less directly. And the first is a historical context. There actually is a single written description of the Celts in both France and in the British Isles by a Roman writer whose name is Tacitus. I'll read what he says. He's referring to the Celts that he was encountering as the Romans expanded out of Rome. They deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails. That sounds really disgusting. And it also sounds like, so the Celts were bloodthirsty and they killed people and they sacrificed them. There's only one problem. There's not a lot of evidence that what he's saying is true. And there's a lot of evidence for what he was writing for an audience back home in Rome that was intended to show that the people they were encountering were primitive and savage. And so it's like, this may be an early version of fake news. Now, I'm not going to say that there's zero evidence for Celts conducting sacrifices, but this kind of wholesale sacrifice, this bloodthirstiness, there's really not a lot of evidence for that. And there are no tables. There are no sacrificial altar stones archaeologically discovered in the region of the British Isles where the Celts were dominant 2,000 years ago or more. There's no evidence for it at all. I find this is an interesting little kind of sidebar. When I went searching for, online, I Googled sacrificial altar stones, Druids, Celts. So I'm looking for, specifically, any evidence in the old world or any photographs, in Wikimedia Commons or whatever, of actual altar stones that with grooves on them for collecting blood back in the UK. And when I type that all up, a lot of the pictures that show up are of the stone in New Hampshire. Now, the altar stone at American Stonehenge can't be the model for the altar stone at American Stonehenge. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work that way. So it's almost as if, well, no, there really aren't any of those altar stones. There are no models for it in the old world. But there are models for it in art. And the art dates to the 19th century, when the Druids were seen as this romantic, ancient, spiritually powerful group, but they were bloodthirsty. And I love this. Personally, I would like to have a large version of that image in a frame in this office so that I can look at this human sacrifice every day, because that's just how I roll, It's an engraving from 1851. It's called Human Sacrifice by a Gaulish Druid, which would be in France. His name, the name of the artist is Felix Philippetot. I just love that image. And what does it show? It shows that white-robed Druid priest with his little garland of leaves. And what is he doing? He's holding a chalice, and he's collecting the blood from that victim who's on the stone, right? A sacrificial altar stone, like the one at American Stonehenge. And you see the poor guy's got a knife in his chest. I think it was rather, nice of them to cut out a little niche for his head so it was comfortable while he was being sacrificed. Sure, why not? You see there at the ground, there are other crania, there are other skulls on the ground, and in the background are the local, the regular Celts who are watching this human sacrifice as part of this Druid ceremony. The problem is, this is a fantasy. We don't have very much direct archaeological evidence that anything like this happened. Again, maybe Tacitus was right. Maybe there are some instances of human sacrifice, but we certainly don't have any of these tables like this. This is a fantasy. The fantasy is repeated again and again in art that dates to the 19th century. So the big image on the left there are a series of sacrificial tables with all that red is the blood of the folks. On the upper right is another sacrificial table with a kind of a Stonehenge-like background. But again, it's fantasy. They have nothing to do with Stonehenge. The image on the lower right is a photograph, 20th century, of kind of play acting a human sacrifice. This stuff is fantasy. This stuff is all 19th century, 20th century. Again, the archaeological record for Western Europe does not show anything like the sacrificial table that's at America's Stonehenge. So I think it's the interpretation of that as a sacrificial table comes not from the ancient Celts, but comes from 19th century fantasies about Druids and human sacrifice. Now, you say, blood evidence. My gosh, Fader, this was a couple thousand years ago. Would there still be blood? There might be. Now, I'm not saying that a lack of blood, if they looked for blood in the interstices of the crystals, in that the little connections between the crystals in the groove, I'm not saying that if they looked for it and didn't find it, it would be proof that there never was blood there. But it is possible that it is. Archaeologists have, in the past, been able to recover blood from tools like knives and spear points, and the recovery, the preservation has been so good, they were able to collect DNA and even tell you what animal was being butchered with that tool from 500 years ago or even 1,000 years ago. So it is at least potentially the case that there would be blood still, enough of it to collect from the groove. It's never been tried as far as I know. So it would be something that I think would be necessary to at least give it a look. And if there was blood, that would mean something. If there wasn't, it's equivocal. How about bronze daggers at the site? This is the Bronze Age, so you would expect that if they're slicing people's throats, there'd be bronze tools there. And there weren't. There are no bronze artifacts at American Stonehenge, and more about that in a minute. I mean, this is the ultimate question. It's got to be, is there any stuff? This is what we started with. It's what I mentioned in Etched in Stone, and it's what I talk about in the How We Know as Archaeologists, the episode that I'm considering to be like the first one. And that is, all right, well, if there were ancient Celts, Druids or otherwise, in North Salem, New Hampshire, a couple thousand years ago, well, we would expect there to be the common, everyday refuse that would not look like what Native Americans were producing, because this is a different culture. It's the Celts of Western Europe. So is there any stuff found in America's Stonehenge? Well, yeah, there actually is a lot of stuff. A lot of artifacts recovered. I think it was 1950s, more than 9,000 artifacts were recovered by an archaeological excavation led by Gary Vasilius, who at the time was an archaeology grad student, and he's connected to Yale University. Most of the artifacts that Vasilius and his crew recovered, well, there was a small sampling of Native American stuff. Well, that's, they were in the area. They lived there for thousands of years. It was one of their homelands. And so, yeah, there are stone spear points and ceramics and stuff like that, all readily identifiable as Native American. There also was a lot of 19th century junk, pottery and metal and glass. But of the 9,000 artifacts recovered, how many were those of ancient Druids or other Celts? And I can say it no more clearly than this. None, not a zilch, zero. Not one object was found there that you could say, oh my gosh, yep, that's ancient Celtic. That proves they were here. I think it was my first visit to Mystery Hill. It was then Mystery Hill, back in the 1970s. And they have a much nicer museum there now. It was a small little place with some objects that had been found at the site. And on one wall, there was a glass case, and most of what was there was Native American stuff. And as an archaeologist in New England, even as I was a lot younger, obviously, even as a student, I looked at, oh yeah, I recognize that. I know these kinds of spear points and that kind of pottery, typical stuff. And then the other case, on the other side, it was all this 19th century, primarily 19th century, metal objects and ceramics, the kinds of stuff you would find at any colonial farmstead or 19th century farmstead here in New England. So I know they were advertising the site as Bronze Age. They talk about it being Bronze Age. So I went to the docent, the person behind the desk, and I, not being snarky at all, I said, well, look, you're calling this a Bronze Age site. I don't see any bronze artifacts. Where are the bronze artifacts that would prove conclusively this was a Bronze Age site? And she looked at me and said, well, sir, you don't think those ancient people would have just left those valuable bronze artifacts lying around, do you? Well, yeah, I actually do, because back in Europe, they did leave those bronze artifacts lying around. That's how we know it was the Bronze Age. Look, I didn't exactly make that face, but I think any archaeologist would respond to that like, what? The archaeological record is filled with stuff that people just left lying around because it was broken, because it was dull, because it was used up, because they lost it. That's what archaeologists do. So you tell me there are no bronze artifacts here because people, they brought them, they took them away? Where'd they put them? They beam them back up to the mothership? No, if you're going to tell me this is Bronze Age and tell me they were using bronze tools to sacrifice people, I need to see some direct evidence, or, like I say in other of these episodes, no artifacts. It didn't happen. So that's a real problem. Well, is the table in a clearly ceremonial context? Is that the only possible explanation is this was used for some kinds of ceremonies that involved human sacrifice? Well, that's a problem. That's a really hard one to answer for anybody, because the site was purchased in the 1930s by William Godwin. And he was, of all things, an insurance adjuster in Hartford. And he took a trip up to New England. He saw the place. He fell in love with it, and he purchased it. And he spent a lot of time reconstructing it. I know this gets people all kinds of angry, saying, no, this is what he looked at, basically. But he wrote a book about his hypothesis that Irish monks, like AD 500, the Common Era, sailed across the Atlantic in their little boats, landed in New England, and established a colony or a monastery here in New England, here in America Stonehenge, or what would ultimately be called America Stonehenge. And so he reconstructed a lot of it. There are photographs that he wasn't trying to hide that, by the way. He took photographs before and after. And you can see whole areas of the site where in the 1930s it was completely collapsed. But by the time he's done and writing the book, he's completely reconstructed it. So it's very hard to know. Here's what I can tell you. The photograph on the upper left is the original altar stone. It looks pretty good. My photograph on the right is a photograph I think I took in the 1970s. Notice there's that big block of stone right adjacent to it. Well, that's not there anymore. They moved that. The photograph on the bottom is probably from my last visit, which could be 10 years ago. So I don't know what's been changed since then. But certainly there's some evidence from the top left to the top right to the bottom that, yeah, okay, it doesn't look exactly the same. That's the photograph on the left is my photograph from recent time. The two photos on the right are from Godwin's book. And yeah, the things look very, very, very different. He completely took it apart and put some of it back together again. So now listen, professional archaeologists are guilty of having done that too. Things that they just say, hey, it must have been like this, but it's problematic. So when people say, no, it could not have been in a ceremonial, it could not be anything but ceremonial because it doesn't make sense. Remember that we're not seeing the site in the 19th century when we think it was being used. Now, this maybe is my favorite part. Is that table unique? Or is there a mundane historical context and there are others just like it used in that mundane context? And the answer is it is not unique. There are other flat slabs of stone with channels for collecting liquid. There are enough of these things that you start wondering, well, if there are sacrificial tables, my gosh, I wouldn't walk around back then in New England because somebody's liable to tap you on the shoulder, grab you, throw you on a table, and collect all your blood. Not a pleasant notion, right? This is from a museum in Hadley, Massachusetts. That's a meter stick on the right, so this is about the size of the Mystery Hill America Stonehenge table. This one is different. It's different raw material, and it has two exits. You notice there's one on the bottom and then one over there on, from your perspective, the left-hand side. But again, it's a flat stone. It's got a channel, a groove, apparently for collecting a liquid. And in this case, it's got two exits. Now, this is a close-up of the exit, very crudely made. And that's me years and years ago. But I still have white hair. It's like 30 years ago or more. And that's me standing next to it. Now, when you're an archaeologist, it's really good to have kids because when you don't have a tape measure with you for scale, everybody knows what a 5 or 6 year old, the size of one. So this was my son, Josh. He's now like 38 or thereabouts. So he must be, that's got to be like more, it's more than 30 years ago. And there he is, my scale, standing right in front of this. Now, because I'm a dad and because I'm a, kind of an idiot, I made the mistake of telling Josh a gruesome story of human sacrifice. I said, Josh, they would take the victim and lay him out on the table. He'd be screaming, but they'd hold him down. And then they would take a knife and slice their artery in their neck, and the blood would come cascading out, like in a Sam Peckinpah movie. And it would collect in these channels. And then they would collect it, they would get it all together in a chalice, and then they would drink the blood. Of course, Josh has got his eyes wide open. I said, no, Josh, that didn't really happen. But then, I said, you know what would be funny, Josh? It would be funny if you were to lie down on that table. And I'll take some pictures. And Josh looked at me and he took a step back. He said, no, thank you. I said, no, Josh, I promise. I'm not going to sacrifice you on the table. Only, rarely would I even thought of that, depending on how he was behaving. No, but I couldn't convince him to lie down on it, so he's standing right there next to it. So that's a lesson for you all when you bring your kids to places like this. don't tell them the gruesome story and then ask for them to lie down on the table. Because if they're smart, they're going to say, no, I demur, I would rather not. So Josh is a smart cookie, so he would not lie down on the sacrificial table. Here's another one. A little bit different. Okay, this one was made probably with metal tools. It's another flat table, flat slab with a channel around it and an exit. This is at Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. This is not on display. I think it's in like outdoor storage. But I found out about it and I asked if they could take a look at it, and they were very nice and accommodating, and they allowed me to look at it. That's a meter scale. It's not quite as big. It's square. It's not a rectangle. But certainly you could put a small person on there and sacrifice them if that's what you wanted to do. But that's not what any of these tables are about. That's a close-up of it. There's this concept of cultural amnesia. I didn't make that up, but I use it a lot. And it's the idea that we forget that technology changes so quickly that we forget what technologies were abundant and apparent and well-known and widely known in the past. I mean, you can see this today. I once had a little cassette, a music cassette that was hidden in an old car. And my younger son, Jacob, at some point picked it up and said, oh, I remember these. So at least he remembered it. How long will it be before people have no idea what a music cassette is? 8-track, forget about it. Again, technology changes so rapidly. Old MP3 players, where you'd have a little memory stick to put in it. Again, show that to a person today, a young person, they might not recognize it at all. Well, expand that much more widely to common things used by folks 100 years ago or even 200 years ago. When I would show my students that object on the left, I'd say, what is that? Usual response was, is it a cutting board? No, it's not. Some smart aleck would say, well, it's a Paleolithic iPad. Yeah, that's what it is, sure. That's exactly what it is. No, it's not that. That, my friends, is a soapstone bed warmer. Well, we don't warm our beds with soapstone anymore. Soapstone is a very heat-retentive rock, and so you put that up against, in the 1700s, 1800s, you put that up against the fire all day. It gets nice and toasty. You pick it up with oven mitts or with tongs, and what you do is you run it under the blanket on top of the bed sheets. Warms up the bed for those really cold nights. And you don't have an electric blanket, and you don't have central heating. Maybe you leave it at the foot of the bed to keep that heat coming out. We don't have that anymore, so if somebody shows you that, you don't know what it is. The artifact on the right, probably most of you know what that is, but maybe not. I had a student once suggest that it was a medieval torture device. I don't even want to think about how that would be used. Oh, it's an apple core and peeler, and for the most part, you can still buy these in the store, but most part, people don't do that anymore. And so you look at it and you go, I don't know. It becomes mysterious only because you're not familiar with it. That brings us to cider making. Most of us don't make cider the old-fashioned way anymore, but the way it was done was after the apples were crushed, they were put in fabric, loose fabric like burlap, and placed on a table. In this case, it's wooden, with a groove around the perimeter and an exit. I'm going to show you this in close-up. The apparatus on top is a screw press. So those are screws. When you turn those screws, there would be a weighted platform at the bottom of them, which would be pushed against the burlap, squeezing the juice out. The burlap catches all the seeds and the stems and all the crap that you don't want, including the skin, but it pushes out all of the liquid. The liquid accumulates in the channels. It exits into a vat, and then you take that and make probably hard cider, because that's going to preserve a lot better than apple cider when you don't have electricity and refrigeration. This is a close-up of a cider press base from Sturbridge Village, and the arrows point to the channel and the exit. So you go, all right, that's wooden. It's sort of like the stone at Mystery Hill, but what about a cider press bedstone? Well, yeah, we've got those too. These photographs are from, believe it or not, there's a cider museum in Hereford in Wales. I think it's Wales or right on the border between Wales and the rest of England. And boy, they've been so nice to me there, and they've supplied me with some photographs. This is a cider operation. That's a press. Again, you see the screw there. You turn it, tightening the screw. It pushes that weighted platform down on top of, again, we've got apple in the burlap there, on that stone table. Now, it doesn't have a channel. It's just recessed, but all of the liquid pours out into that vat that's right there. Here's a photograph of a gentleman at this cider mill. Now, this is obviously a modern photograph, and he's got those like bags of burlap in which the mashed apples are placed. Again, that filters out all the stuff you don't want, and then you turn the screw, you turn the press, it pushes it down. Now, what you're looking at there on the base of it is a cider press bedstone. It's a big flat slab of rock that's got a channel around it. In this case, it's got this cool like peninsula coming out from the front, but it's just like the Mystery Hill, America's Stonehenge. So here it is in close up. You see the channel that's been placed in there. That vat on the bottom is where you collect the liquid. In the background is a mill. It's a horse-drawn mill. The horse walks. As the horse walks, it's tethered to this big stone. The stone crushes the apples in a circular channel. More about that towards the end of this presentation. That crushed stuff, that apple mash, is what's put in the burlap. The burlap is then laid on the stone. The stone then collects all of the liquid as the press is pushing down on it, squeezing out all the liquid, and now you've got the raw material for some good apple cider. This is, again, two modern guys doing this reenactment of the production of cider. The arrow is pointing to the liquid that's coming down off of it. So when you look at the totality of the evidence, we have the stone from America's Stonehenge on the upper left, Hadley Museum upper right, Sturbridge Village lower left, Sturbridge Village lower right. It's pretty obvious that the stone at America's Stonehenge is a pretty good replica of the others. And so I'm sorry for all of you who were hoping there's human sacrifice in North Salem, New Hampshire a couple of thousand years ago. What they're producing tastes a lot better. It's apple cider. Now I say that, never having actually tasted blood, but I'm going to assume that cider, which I like a lot, is probably a better deal. Now, again, I want to thank the folks at the Cider Museum in the UK. When I told the woman, Elizabeth Pimblett, give her all props there, who provided me with photographs, and we had conversation via email. When I told her, she said, well, why do you want photographs of this? And I said, well, I'm talking about, this is for my book, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience and Archaeology. Yes, I'm hawking the book again. When I was looking for photographs for the book, I said, look, I need a photograph because there's a site here in New England that has one of these stones, but the people who own the place say it was used for human sacrifice. And she, being a proper British person, responded in this remarkably clear and concise way. She said to me, that is something I've never heard before. A sacrificial stone? How utterly stupid. All right, don't get mad at me. I'm just quoting Elizabeth here, Elizabeth Pimblett, who knows cider, who knows cider press bedstones, and knows the history of that industry. So, yeah, probably not an altar stone. Now, the bad news, the sad news that I have to add is that a couple of years ago, the altar stone was vandalized by a dude who was a QAnon follower. Kenny, what? What? Yeah, apparently he and one of his buddies decided that there really was human sacrifice going on at the altar stone now. And that they were sacrificing QAnon. They were sacrificing human children and collecting their blood and collecting their adrenal glands and using those, the deep state was using those to revitalize themselves. That, by the way, is an old trope in science fiction that you can, older guys, if they take like monkey serum, suddenly they get, oh yeah, no, I'm fine. Or even human blood of some young vital man. An older man can inject that and suddenly he becomes young and vigorous and vital. Well, that's what QAnon had. These QAnon dudes believe that. A friend of mine, Jeb Card, who's a brilliant scholar, knows a lot about weird stuff. He initially looked at that photograph and said, what's carved into the base is WWG1WGA. At the January 6th insurrection, you can see people wearing T-shirts that had those letters. It's where we go as one, we go all together. It's a QAnon phrase. Now, the moron who did this on top wrote, I am Mark. Another brilliant researcher who on Twitter, he is, or whatever you want to call Twitter now, he is feminist propaganda. If you want to look him up, he did the really deep dive into this, and he found the guy. The guy was talking about it in social media. My God, if you're going to break the law, break into some place and vandalize something, don't effectively leave your calling card. And the poor guy had a tough life, this guy, and he was arrested. They tracked him down based on the data provided by feminist propaganda, who just went online and searched in all these bizarre, dark places on the web. He found the whole story, and the guy ended up getting arrested. And I have not been back since, but my understanding is they've done as good a job as they can at fixing it, which I'm all for that. It was terrible what this guy did. He vandalized a really cool historical artifact. For my money, historical artifact for making apple cider, not for sacrificing people, but still an important artifact. All right, let's move outside. We've got the sacrificial table there. How about these caves? How about these chambers? This is the Acton Chamber in Acton, Massachusetts, right? It's a stone chamber. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these spread throughout the Northeast. Now, there are people who say these are ancient Celtic. There are people who say these were actually built by Native Americans. People say a lot of stuff about these chambers, but what we know historically is that farmers built these as outbuildings on their farms for cold storage. So we have these chambers that are ice houses for keeping ice cold. There are chambers for keeping root crops cold. Now, we don't want them to freeze, but we don't want them to rot in the sun. And we know that. We have diary accounts of people talking about building these things in the late 1800s and even the early 1900s. So we're pretty sure they're built by the European settlers of New England. Well, how do you know? Remember, I keep harping on the fact that it's artifacts, it's garbage, it's people's stuff. What kind of stuff do we find in these chambers? The Acton Stone Chamber, which is open to the public, it's part of a really cool nature area and a beautiful hike. In order to make this safe for people to walk into, because I walked into it, you're allowed to, there it is up in Massachusetts, they had to stabilize some of the walls. So here I am on the outside looking in. There's like an L corner. Here I am on the inside looking out. Beautiful stonework, dry laid stone masonry, just like the stone walls all throughout New England. They excavated. They actually hired excavators, archaeologists to excavate. What do they find inside the stone chamber? Excavated in 2007. They found nails, glass, crockery, farm implements, and smoking pipes, all datable to the 19th century. That's part of a rake that was found, one of the cooler artifacts found inside the chamber. So again, just like in America's Stonehenge, when you look at the archaeology of these places, that evidence shows pretty clearly that it's 18th century or 19th century. It's not ancient, it's not alien, it's part of a colonial or European, Euro-American historical pattern. Couple more for you, or one more for you anyway. This is a double row of stones carved in a circle, concentric. Pretty weird, right? What is that about? What does that mean? Is that some kind of a ceremonial thing? What's the deal with that? This is Gunjawam, Connecticut, which is located right here in Connecticut, southeastern Connecticut. Now, this is what it looks like in full sun. Double row of stones, it's a circle. There's a channel there. What could it possibly be? Again, ceremonial, is it a sacrificial stone? And I intentionally took this photograph from the left side here. This is a historical photograph from the early 20th century of not the same place, but a very similar object. It's a bark mill. Again, we don't do this anymore, so it's like mysterious, right? Well, no, it's not that mysterious if you look at the historical record. Bark mill was used for the collection of tannin from the oak bark or from acorns. That tannin was then used in the leather industry in producing leather. So to take an animal hide and make it into leather, you need tannins. That's what's called tanning it. And how do you extract that? Well, you use a little water and you crush it all up. Now, you've probably been to historical recreations or seen old mills where there's a mill wheel and the water comes from a stream and it runs it round and round, and that powers a mill wheel that grinds grain, for example, or that works a saw up and down. Well, here you don't need that kind of power. You just need something to crush stuff. So that wheel, that vertical wheel, it's pretty heavy, runs in the channel between the two circles of stone. It is connected by a horizontal axle that then connects to a vertical axle in the middle. You then have a horse or a mule or an oxen who you attach to the outside of it, and all you're doing is encouraging that animal to walk, and the animal is walking in a circle. And as the animal walks in a circle, the big millstone turns, and anything it encounters, it crushes. So that's a bark mill. This is a really nice historical photograph of a bark mill. This is from Connecticut. I don't have a date on this, but I'm guessing late 19th century, maybe early 20th century. Much larger one. Here you've got actually a team of oxen who are pulling it around, crushing the material between those two rows of the circular fragments of stone, the quarried stone. Again, we don't do that anymore, so it's forgotten. But if you are out in the woods anywhere hiking and you see what look like a double row of stones, the odds are you have encountered a mill where and you can crush a number of other things, but for the most part, these things are called bark mills. Now, you have to remember the cliche, and it's a cliche that I've used, maybe overused, but it's the old saying, pics or it didn't happen. Well, the archaeological version of this is artifacts or it didn't happen. And in the case of America's Stonehenge, in the case of Gunjiwump, in the case of the Acton Stone Chamber, when artifacts are found, the kinds of stuff unique to a particular group of people or in a particular time, it indicates that these things date to the 19th century, maybe the early 20th century. And it is sort of absolutely, I think, conclusive when not a single artifact datable to, say, 2,000 years ago, traceable to Western Europe, and that one of those is found at these sites. It's a pretty good bet. It's more than a pretty good bet that they weren't responsible. They weren't here in antiquity building these places. That as odd as these places may look, as idiosyncratic as they may look, as inexplicable or mysterious as they may look to you with your modern 21st century vision, they aren't at all. And what I always say to people is, these are sites, these are places, these are artifacts that 200 years ago, a 5-year-old could tell you exactly what it was. But today, an educated person is going to have problems figuring out what this was. And so therefore, the field is wide open for people to fantasize and to make up bloodthirsty druids every chance they get. That's my story of sacrificial tables and sacred chambers. See you next time.